All right, let's get into our first topic then. And should children be allowed to change their gender? We do want to hear your thoughts on this. Now, a groundbreaking report has been released calling for the NHS to completely overhaul the care it provides for children who want to change gender. The Cass report has found that thousands of children who were unsure of their gender identity were effectively let down by the NHS by being given unproven treatments like hormone drugs and puberty blockers. Now, the report author, Dr Hilary Cass, has said that there is remarkably weak evidence that the treatment improves the lives of young people.
Frustrating when the debate is so toxic and you feel that there are some really important societal issues that mainly impact adults, and children are caught up in this, and the point scoring that's going on. It just means that we can't talk openly about what the right thing for them is. If people ask me, would I do this again? The answer is yes, because I've become more and more passionate as time has gone on about wanting to see things change for this group of young people.
Now, the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has also said that allowing children to change their gender is not a natural act. Marvyn, what do you make of all of this? I mean, you've got young children, so you must be listening to this with a keen ear.
Yeah, absolutely. And I find it so bizarre what the strength of resistance is and why people struggle so much to acknowledge that there are a group of people who are having an experience. And this isn't like a new experience. This is just one that we're now having a public debate upon. We've invited young people to actually submit evidence and insight and experiences of what they're going through so we can hold a much better view. But the fundamental point is a group of young people are being completely let down by the NHS because of how much is being politicised, but also just by the lack of organisation and the lack of evidence and data that's being collected to be able to hold a really strong view. We can't sit there and say that we shouldn't be doing something or should be doing something without a clear view as to what it is that what they're actually experiencing and how we can support them. If they don't have support, then what we're going to start seeing happening is really strong resolve is going to be where it's like, you're not listening to me and I want this no matter what now, rather than the fact that this actually could be something to be explored. And we have to find the fundamental difference between people who, at what point in their adulthood are they allowed to make the decision for themselves, and at what point are we supporting them into that particular point.
So you actually don't think they should be allowed to make the decision as children to change their gender then?
I think chemical or medical transitioning is different to how they wish to be social notification as to how they wish to be identified. I think it's really powerful that they take ownership of how they want to be identified really early on. But I think in terms of like having ownership and doing permanent shifts, that should happen at a particular point. That's my view now. But the fact is, every single time I listen to someone who's experienced it, I listen to the stories, the testament of those parents, my view so starts to change, because actually everything that I know about living in existence that's different to others, the last thing you want to do is hear other people telling you how your existence should be. Okay,
so you're happy to do social gender change then for
Absolutely.
Children, but from what age? So can a 4-year-old make that decision?
Absolutely,
a 5-year-old?
and look, I think we get so focused on what that means, because inherently it's like if a young boy is saying I feel like I'm a girl and I want to be referenced with girl pronouns and she and her, we feel like that has such an immediate threat on our safety and our logical way of doing things that we just reject it immediately and say that it's stupid, or that this person is just like hasn't been parented properly. We go to such violent extremes. The reality is that they're communicating to us, and you have to listen to what's being said. And actually, even if you don't agree, the way that you do it isn't just to shut them down. The way is to actually be open to what it is they're saying and introduce them into ideas and expand that conversation with them. I do that now with my 6 and 8-year-old, and you have profound discovery when you start listening and having conversations with them, even at that age.
What do you think, Carole? I mean, there is a distinction between social change and a physical or chemical change.
Yeah, I don't think this report is about stopping kids changing their gender. I don't think it's about denying the experience they're having. I don't think it's about not supporting them. I think it's about private clinics prescribing harmful drugs, drugs that are going to damage children's bones, that are going to change their bodies forever, and they're giving out these hormones with little or no evidence. What this report says, what the Cass report says, is that the evidence that exists is scant. But what we do know is that these drugs are being given to children who then go and have their bodies mutilated on the strength of that. They become infertile, and a lot of them then decide they want to detransition, but they can't, because the damage has been done already. This is what this report is designed to stop. And what it's designed to stop is this very small minority of voices that somehow has got massive sway in the NHS and in schools, where if you dare to criticise their ideology, if you dare to criticise their belief, it is an ideology.
That's not an ideology.
But what you're getting onto now is actually the politicising of it, because you're not necessarily talking about the 0.5% of children that this might affect. It has been politicised,
and that's the point. And anyone who has spoken out against this, anyone who's talked about the mutilation of young people's bodies, they're bullied, they get death threats, they get cancelled. You know,
because it's not your experience.
How much damage has the free-for-all on these drugs done for kids in the last decade?
It's not your experience. This is an experience about the experience of a group of people who have gone through something.
So you think
even the people who have identified they would like to detransition are absolutely a part of the conversation, and that needs to be looked into. But having external voices, people who have platforms, people who have power, having such strong, hard views
like
on
ourselves,
something.
potentially.
Exactly, but that impacts those lives without the care of what that creates for them.
What about
it's careless.
The Tavistock Clinic had to be closed down because of the damage it had done young people. Damage that cannot be changed, cannot be rectified. That's what this report is about. It's saying stop giving drugs to kids who just say, I don't think I'm in the right body. They have to be looked at, they have to be assessed over.
And what should the process be? This is the point, is that we're saying
over a long period of time.
No, but I'm saying that we've removed this idea and we're saying let's not do this. Great. But there's no real structured support way of how we're going to do things differently.
Well, yes, but that's what she's asking for.
What I'm saying, in the gap, that's where a lot of people are harmed also. So if we're calling for things to be changed without a full review as to what should happen, and that being agreed upon by the people that it matters for, then we're doing a disservice.
I'm glad you're really passionate on this subject, both of you, but I just want to bring in someone who does have a bit more experience. Let's now speak to Katie John Went on this. Now, Katie, you're a diversity and inclusion campaigner, and you've been looking into the Cass report today. You went through this process in your adult life, but how do you feel the NHS handles this situation when it comes to children?
Well, I actually think the report is quite sane and quite humane, and that's what's been lacking in the whole thing. And the biggest issue for me is that 90% of the report people will pick up on the kind of the medical evidence side and the recommendations. But the biggest recommendation Hilary Cass made is, how do we have this conversation without yelling, without polarizing over this, without one side trying to kind of either get rid of the report or one side trying to say she didn't say enough. She still said trans people exist. And she said that there should be this holistic, this cautious approach, and that we should be bringing in a kind of a wider range of services to look after young people's mental health when young people are questioning their gender, not to assume that if they are questioning their gender, that all of their problems will be solved by a transgender pathway. In other words, to only look at the child through a gender identity lens and not recognize the comorbidities and intersectional nature of young person kind of mental health, and then what they are navigating as a group of people who have some of the greatest freedoms in the world to date at the age they are. But on the other hand, some of the greatest stresses and pressures with everything on social media and what they are seeing and the challenges that exist around them to how they appear, how do they look, how do they behave, how do they belong. And there isn't really the holding environment for that. And there's just like a pathway instead. So using kind of transgender as the solution to a multitude and a variety of questions around body dysmorphia rather than gender dysphoria, around eating disorders, around self-harm, around neurodiversity, around autistic spectrum disorder, etc. There's not enough look at the other things that are going on besides, let alone the social media contagion.
So in your opinion, when we talk about this, a sort of slower approach, a more cautious approach when it comes to children, that does sound sensible. However, you're potentially putting off something that could change an individual's life for the better, and it's sort of weighing up that process. Do you think that in this report that Hilary Cass has it right, that we need a much, much slower approach and stop putting children on these hormone drugs and puberty blockers?
Well, the puberty blockers existed previously for things like people with precocious puberty, someone who started at puberty in their single-digit years, and to put it on pause so it occurs at a more appropriate time. I come from the other end of the spectrum. I was in a clinic for 7 years because I didn't have a puberty as a teenager until my 18th year. So I had the opposite, delayed onset puberty, and you can have these two extremes. So puberty blockers were already in developed, and so were kind of puberty enhancers or human growth hormone I was nearly given as well. But the point is, these things exist. They weren't invented for trans kids. They were then, kids who were questioning their gender. But they have been applied to it, and I have grown to the opinion that they are not a good idea, because everybody put on them goes through the process of cross-sex hormones and transitions later. So they become a de facto kind of inevitability. And if that's the case, they're not being used for their original purpose, which was to put puberty on pause so that the person can ascertain who they are, what they are, and navigate that critical stage of life. And plus, as Carol's already said, it does affect everything from bone density to height to development. And as even transgender surgeons have said, it affects the physical development and the physical material necessary for physical transition as an adult. And it affects the kind of the psychological and endocrinological material to develop sexuality itself, to develop the ability to enjoy a sexual life, etc. So those things will be lost, let alone infertility. So those things are lost if you put someone on the inevitable journey of puberty blockers. So I have come to the opinion that their use should be suspended. It should be incredibly rare when used, and it should be for an incredibly short period of time, whilst you bring in that psychosocial support to ascertain what is going on in that person's life. And it's a yes. It's as an adult, if I was given the choice in hindsight, if I had a TARDIS and I could go back in time and say, yes, please give me puberty blockers, I probably would have said yes, because there are things that as an adult you wish didn't develop if you are transgender. But hindsight is not the prerequisite for kind of medical clinical decisions.
Katie, thank you very much. Please stay with us. I just want to take a couple of calls. We're getting lots of calls through. Kimberly, I believe you are a trans woman. What's your views on this? Do we need to stop giving children puberty blockers and hormone treatments?
Hi, darling. Hi, panel. Yes, I am definitely. It's the worst thing ever that I've heard of. I do a lot of work with transgender children within the Essex area at schools and do seminars and talks. It's become a fad. It's become a fashion statement. Now, I can only speak for myself. I was given a gender dysphoria diagnosis at 19.
Okay.
I had my gender reassignment surgery 14 years ago.
So how long was that between the two?
It's not nice. Sorry?
How long was that between the two before you had a diagnosis of gender dysphoria and you were allowed to have the surgery, or you got to have the surgery? What was the time?
Well, I was 19 when I got diagnosed because I was developing breasts at 14. I had my GRS, my surgery 14 years ago. So a big gap.
So a very big gap.
Private.
And presumably that wasn't a comfortable gap for you, Kimberly. You would have rather that gap was a lot shorter.
Yeah, well, I was bounced around by different psychiatrists and people wanting to say, are you sure, are you sure, are you sure? So eventually I went to Canada and had my GRS, but that's not viable for everybody. No,
it's certainly not, which is why when I'm looking at this Cass report then, which is asking for a slower process, I understand we're talking about children and you were 19 when you were diagnosed, but we're talking about a slower process. That might be quite painful for children who are in fact transgender, because I'm presuming what we're looking at here is trying to whittle out the individuals who may think it's a bit of a fad, who might be confused in other ways, who might have neurodivergency.
When I speak to children at school seminars and on Zoom and that, it's because my friend does this, my friend does that, it's peer pressure and it's in vogue. It's so wrong because it's not a nice world out there being transgender. I get hate crime all the time. I had it this morning. I'll probably get it tomorrow. You know,
Kimberly,
you do get these things. You know, it's a horrible world out there.
It's so sad to hear that. I actually just want to ask Katie, do you think that there is a bit of a trend amongst the young people? Would they be Gen Alpha or Gen Z at the moment, that becoming trans is a sort of fashionable thing to do, a cool thing to do?
I don't think it's overly cool in that sense, because being trans, as Kimberly's just described as well, as an adult or even as a teen, it isn't an easy pathway. The idea that being trans is a solution to avoid being gay or lesbian, because that is a dilemma to you, I don't think is particularly true either. Yes, there's an identity crisis when you're trying to work out what it is, but being trans is not an easy path. So I don't think people gonna go into it thinking this is the answer to all my problems. I think sometimes it has been served up and seen to be, hey, if you exhibit these things, then you must be trans. And I think people are kind of confused into saying, oh, that is the answer to my problems, when actually there's a whole kind of basket of different things going on, and nobody is willing to unpick that basket, because we've created an environment and the polarization around this in which everybody from clinicians to family members to schools is scared to unpick it all, because we're afraid to ask the questions, because we'll be seen as transphobic on the one hand or kind of something else on the other hand. We've got to recreate an environment in which it is okay to ask questions honestly and say, so when did you first start feeling these things? Are there other things that this could be caused by? Have you considered this? Everyone is too scared to talk and have the conversation.
Well, that was definitely in the report as well, that the toxicity amongst this conversation has led to doctors being unable to share their views about it and I suppose expertise. Kimberly, thank you very much for your call. Grace from London, you're up next. Do you think we outright ban these puberty blockers for this sort of thing for children that are having issues around their gender identity?
Yeah, I mean, I can understand why a person would want to block puberty if they're ultimately going to transition, because it might make it easier in some respects if they've not been through puberty, but I do think that they should be banned. I essentially blocked my own puberty, not deliberately, but I was seriously anorexic. And so before I started periods, I was starving myself, and I ultimately ended up with osteoporosis. So these things do have a long-term impact. And I think that to be caring for someone, particularly a young person, doesn't necessarily mean agreeing with all of the feelings that they express about themselves. When I was, telling my parents or doctors that I felt that I ought to be thinner, they didn't say, well, yes, we're going to help you be thinner and we think that you're right to feel that you should be thinner. They questioned the feelings that I had about myself. And I think that sometimes young people will feel things about themselves that are actually not correct or not healthy for them in the long term.
That may be correct in how they're feeling then, but may
Absolutely.
change. Grace, interesting to hear from you. Thank you very much for your call. And interesting, you both brought up the fact that these puberty blockers can have other impacts actually for your health too. Jane from East Sussex, what's your thoughts on puberty blockers? Do we need to get rid of them and hormonal drugs?
Not just puberty blockers, I believe cross-sex hormones also until the age of at least 25, because the teenage brain is not developed until 25. And if anyone actually takes the time to read the full cash review, they will see Dr Cass does flag the adult clinics as well. It shocks me tremendously that the media have not picked up on the damage that has been done by children who are non-conforming. Those children, because a girl has short hair does not make her a male, because a boy has long hair does not make him female. How these children feel is not a medical condition. How these children feel is confused, which is part of being a teenager. They need to... Sorry, I apologise.
You have some experience in this with your own child?
Yes, there is a narrative in society which is that broadly broadcasted by Stonewall, Mermaids, many activist organisations, that the waiting list for these clinics are 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, 10 years in some cases, and that may indeed be the case previously. However, the adult gender clinics have now been approved. There were 7, I think it was 7 pilot clinics. Those pilot clinics are now have funding within the NHS, those adult clinics, to see teenagers from the age of 17. There is a case currently was at the Royal Courts of Justice recently with 2 mothers, Anna Castle
Okay, let's not. I don't want to get into specifics.
Sorry, I apologise. I apologise. Yes, my son and my daughter are caught up in this nightmare, and one of those children has access to cross-sexual hormones via an adult clinic after 2 years.
And you're unhappy about this?
Desperately unhappy, because my child will have irreversible damage done to their bodies.
How old is your child who has access to the hormones?
19 years of age.
Well, I mean, technically they would be an adult, Jane.
Yes, but do you believe that at 19 you were fully formed? Were you fully formed in your identity?
Do you know, and your brain isn't developed till you're 25, but you can still make, in this country we have decided that age is the age of an adult, and you can make really big life decisions at the age of 18, and so do you make an exception?
That question's informed consent. Yeah. Informed consent after a meeting of possibly 10 minutes to allow you to have cross-sex hormones that will damage you.
Can I just, Jane, can I just support you here? Yes, people can make big decisions at the age of 19, but not about changing your gender. That's a massive decision.
It's not our place to say.
But it is our place to say.
It so.
People who care about
made it legally so already.
Marvyn,
then talk about the broader issue of actually the age of consent for everything. We can't just say that because this particular issue we don't like, actually we can't allow you to have consent on this particular area, but you can open a bank account, you can buy a house, you can do all this, you can get married, you can have sex, you can do all these different things under that banner, but not this. So what my point is that if there is a disconnect between a parent and a child in terms of what the process that they're going through, the actual number one thing that makes this harder is the language that goes on and around this conversation. Now, if someone comes to me and says that they wish to transition, me being engaged in that conversation and asking the questions that we've discussed earlier, that we've heard earlier, that actually it may not be that. It may be other things. It may be neurodivergent. It may be other areas of your life you need support with. That support does not exist in society. And actually, the dialogue and the way that we exist around each other means that we're so attacking of ideas that we have or experiences that people are having that it makes people double down in their feeling because they're never going to be heard.
Okay, but Carole, you're in agreement actually with Jane, and you think it's appalling that they should have access to this.
When Marvyn talked over me. Yes, I'm in total agreement that at the age of 19, your personality is not fully formed. Yes, you're entitled to make decisions, you're entitled to vote, all sorts of things. But to change your sex is a massive, massive thing. And what she also pointed out was that caring about somebody and telling them your views on it is not interfering with their decisions. You know, we talk about children's rights all the time. Children at 14, 15, 16, they're not mature enough to make that kind of decision. But these clinics, and you know.
So at what age are you mature enough to make that decision?
Well, you're certainly not mature at the age of 14.
What age would you say? 25?
I would say I'd say you need to get to 20 before you start before you
20,
start.
So that's only a couple of months away for Jane's child.
Yeah, it is, but this hasn't just happened. I mean, this has been happening for years. She's been talking to her child about this. He didn't just decide at 19 that he or she wanted to change. I don't know if it's a boy or a girl. But I just think it's really important that we stop giving kids, we stop attributing adult maturity to 14, 15, 16-year-old kids because they don't have it. And to allow them to take drugs that change their bodies forever is totally irresponsible. And that's what Hilary Cass has talked about.
Well, then we've got into an even more interesting area then if we're going to say we're going to stop anyone being able to physically transition as a child. At what age do we allow it then? Because Jane has an issue with 19, Carole has an issue with 19, and Marvyn doesn't. Katie, what age do you think is an appropriate age to start allowing someone to physically transition?
Well, it is interesting when you're just talking about the levelling of different ages of consent. Obviously, in the US, you can't drink till you're 21, but you can have a car and a gun at a much earlier age than we would ever consider giving someone like that. But I think the issue is, and this has come up a little bit as well, is the fact that, you know, when I kind of entered the NHS kind of gender pathway, it took 6 to 8 years. So even if I'd have gone into that at the age of 18, I wouldn't have been allowed hormones for a minimum of 2 years. That was then 2 to 3 years, and then surgery 3 or 4 years after that. So it would never have happened until I was 25, and I do agree that the prefrontal cortex, the frontal lobes, don't really get mature until 23 to 25. Yeah. And for 10 years, we're driven by our hormones. So I do think it's about slowing it down, and even if we started at 18, but then making it slow from 18. But however slow you make it, you have to plug the gaps, because the gaps are where the mental distress happen, which means means enhancing the funding for support services and therapy and counsellors and social workers, etc., because there's a massive disconnect between child and adolescent mental health care and adult healthcare in the mental health field.
All right, I want to get another call in very quickly. This is Jane, thank you for your call. Laura from Tyne and Weir. What's your views on puberty blockers? That's what we're really talking about here for children.
Well, I think the earlier that we can stop puberty, the better. Like, the body goes through, like, obviously through puberty, it goes through a massive change. And if we can stop that process at an early enough age, just before puberty, then we can actually make a difference. Like, all of the negative effects of puberty can be stopped until the child has enough time to think what they're going to do next, and give enough time for psychotherapy and other kind of counselling if needed.
Even though, Laura, that stopping and taking these puberty blockers can cause ill health in other ways?
You know, it is that ill health, if we don't take the medication, there is a high proclivity of suicide in this community, my own community. Me, myself, if I had that early intervention, I grew up in the 80s, so I didn't really get that kind of. I had a transphobic family. I've been ostracized by all my family and a lot of my friends. I was ostracized at school because I was presenting feminine.
But Laura, maybe that's where the problem is. Maybe it's not that we needed to block your puberty. Maybe it is we actually needed to make society a little bit more accepting.
Do you know
so that you could have longer to make that decision.
Do you know what it is? It's people like the Prime Minister who are standing up and saying that these transphobic things, and it is people like your previous callers who are essentially TERFs, dictating, cisgender people dictating what transgender people should do. We should give children the right that they understand their mind at a very early age, right? A lot of adults get it wrong. These children know what they want. We know as heterosexual people that we're attracted to the opposite sex.
Well, Laura, to be fair on that one, lots of people get confused around puberty on that, and it adjusts itself later on.
But we know from an early age what we are.
You can't call a concerned parent a TERF. It's just a derogatory term, and it's totally unnecessary. And as for the other callers we've had on today, they've been incredibly sensible and incredibly rational on this matter. And to slate them as TERFs is really not fair.
OK, but Laura does hold a different view and comes from a different perspective to any of us and her own experiences.
Well, not to the trans women we've had on earlier.
No, certainly not. But everybody, trans or not, has a different experience, particularly through puberty and teenage years in school. I mean, it's hard enough for
but it is. But you know, it's that kind of language. You know, I hate the toxicity around this debate. If we had more people like Katie and more people like Kim who were on earlier, this kind of toxicity.
But that's
would never
easy for you
happened.
to say because Katie and our earlier callers had similar views to yourself, and I suppose that's the thing is we have to open up.
I'm talking about trans activists who try to shut down any discussion on this issue. That's what I'm talking about. Who get aggressive, who are bullying, who threaten people.
But this is just a trans woman sharing her view.
Well, I know it's a trans woman sharing her view, but I'm saying she's just called a parent a TERF.
OK, well, this report's been described as a landmark report. We can only hope that there'll be more insight into this and we can hear more information about it and maybe even more money put into it too. Laura, thank you for your call. Thank you very much, Katie John Went, for joining us on that conversation.